I'll tell you when we're live. Yes, we are live. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first meeting amongst many to come this year. Is that right, Dan? Is this the first meeting? The second meeting? My bad. And I'm really happy to be taking Danielle's position today, to be stealing his chair as the moderator. And he is going to be a mere participant, a mere guest. So I'm going to do the introductions. I'm Joel Windle. I'm a professor of language studies here in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm here to welcome Danielle Ferraz, who is Professor of English Language at the University of São Paulo, and also Robert Mizzi, who is Professor of his research chair in Queer, Community and Diversity Education at the University of Manitoba. So really looking forward to hearing you guys introduce your thoughts on the topic of queer education and queer language education. And I'm just going to make a couple of opening remarks about my own recent reflections about sexuality and education. So if Michelle wants to share those slides, I will comment about two or three examples here. So the first one, I believe, is going to be the so-called gay kit or kitschy gay.
I think, Michelle. I think not the. Are you using the PowerPoint? The I don't. No, not this one, Michelle. I think it's the image, Joe.
Yeah, sure. The image is good. So don't worry about the image then. Maybe I'll show it at the end. The presidential elections of 2018 in Brazil were marked by the connection between education, sexuality, and moral panic. And the successful candidate Bolsonaro used fear of teachers promoting so-called gender ideology, communism, pedophilia, and particularly teaching using a set of resources that he called the gay kit, which was a kind of fake news. And part of the gay kit included a baby's bottle with in the shape of a penis, which was circulated in WhatsApp groups, on Facebook amongst conservative Christian groups and far-right parties. And so I think this is the image showing Bolsonaro on the national nightly news with what he claimed to be part of the gay kit in his hand. Another piece of fake news there, Jesus is a transvestite, apparently being written on the T-shirt of the Communist Party candidate. And there you can see the baby's bottle, allegedly part of the gay kit as well. So, of course, in Brazil, it's inevitable that you can move on to that next picture, that this kind of move will be transformed at Carnival and other moments to be turned on its head. Here we can see three people who are making fun of the gay kit by using it as part of costumes during Carnival a year ago. And at the front of the photo is Carlos Fabiano, who was an English teacher here in Rio. He was somebody who was politically engaged in a number of causes. He founded the Black and Indigenous students study group at his school. And I'm also sharing this image not just because it's an example of queering an oppressive kind of practice, but also to pay my respects to Carlos Fabiano, who unfortunately passed away last week, one of many victims of the current pandemic. So I'm leaving that image as an image of hope and passing on then to Robert to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Joel. Very interesting images, and I think we can really start to see a formation of a theme here. And it's good to meet all of you virtually, and hopefully we can continue the conversations in chat and afterwards as well, because we'll have this good snapshot of what queer theory is about within education, language education. But as you'll see, the conversation needs to continue, and the dialogue needs to take on new forms and in different contexts and such. I'd like to just begin with my PowerPoint. So Michelle, if you could just show the first slide, and we'll just to give you a sense of what I'll be referring to. Most of you have read the article that is based this conversation on. There we go. Thank you. And we're just going to draw on queer theory within educational context. I'm going to deconstruct heteroprofessionalism, which is the concept that I've introduced into the queer lexicon, just to try to get some sort of understanding about how there could be some very microaggressive and some sort of oppressive elements within schools and other educational organizations that can stifle queerness and queer development. So moving to the next slide. I typically go to Anna Marie Jagrous's work around queer theory because I really like her work around relationalities. And this is where she talks about how queer describes those gestures or analytical models which dramatize incoherencies in the allegedly stable relations between chromosomal sex, gender, and sexuality. So queer is markedly unlike those traditional political movements which kind of ground themselves within a fixed identity model. Through Jagrous's approach, we see that there's more focus on relationalities and critiques of structures and such. So while queer may connect with other identities, it's not a category or a state of being within this framework. So while queer acceptance may be the tool of measurement, for saying we've come a long way and more of society has accepted queer people, that can actually be also a point of anxiety for some queer people, because it really prioritizes queer identity or queer sexual practices, for example, and less so on the relationships or on how to change structures. If we move on to the next slide, I also pulled on Michael Warner's heteronormativity. I really enjoyed and really glad that he's provided this, and many other people have interpreted heteronormativity differently. But this Warner's approach is to expose how institutions accept and reproduce heterosexuality as so-called normal, and therefore the dominant identity marker in the classroom or in the school. Heteronormativity knows no boundaries. It goes everywhere. Psyches, social institutions, practices, and knowledge systems. Michael Warner's was influenced by Michel Foucault and how power operates in the construction of sex and sexual categories. Moving on to the next slide. So deconstructing professionalism, or as I'm kind of playing with, is professionalism anti-queer? So professionalism really became noted as a form of control through Illich's earlier work, so in the 1970s. So that's really how far back this goes. So if you're seeing that word professionalism popping up in different types of schooling contexts, there's often not a quick kind of understanding of what that means. And that is problematic, because when we don't have an understanding, that's where we will see some sort of people co-opting the term to manage another group of people. And that's where you see the words such as that's very unprofessional language, or very unprofessional dress, or unprofessional practice. And it's just thrown around without any clear understanding what that means. It affords autonomy and power to acceptable, what's so-called acceptable professional identities, practices, and knowledge, but it's also blurred with managerialism. And that's where we get that kind of problematic space happening. Teacher professionalism, which examines more of the deeper understandings and collaborations, but it really has been rooted within male, middle class, and I think presumably straight identity discourse. So that's where we want to kind of unfix teacher professionalism and show some areas where there's could be room for improvement in understanding about what that actually means. If you can move on to the next slide. So heteroprofessionalism is what I introduced in the Journal of Homosexuality, and then I continued it on with the book chapter that you read as part of prior to this webinar. And heteroprofessionalism explores how heteromasculine dominance as a normative function of an organization. So why is everyone considered cisgender and straight and given power for that stable identity in the school? That's one of the points of where I'm trying to question why. So you can see some tenets to heteronormativity there. How does discourses of professionalism devalue queer non-identities or identities, histories and understandings and relations and so forth? So how and why is queer expression and relationships considered unprofessional? That's the big question here. And if they are considered unprofessional, then what's the roots to that? What has caused that value to be affixed to professionalism? Moving on to the next slide. We see also a silencing of teachers who make attempts to change heteronormative work situations. So it's actually very actively engaged as a model toward oppressing those who try to make some changes. Why are building an inclusive system not part of the teacher's job? So if a teacher is told you're only there to teach the curriculum and not create spaces for inclusivity or changing the system so that it's more amenable for queer people, relationships, or any other marginalized people, then what's the purpose of the teacher's job? Why isn't that not part of their profession? And then last, I argue that it's a creation of policies and programs that ignore queer realities. Why is queerness downplayed or erased in school policies and programs? What are the roots to this exclusion? And so this is where we get a little bit more problematic, because if you're so-called creating inclusive school systems and yet you're excluding identities or people, then you're kind of creating a fake inclusiveness then, the spin-off of the fake news. You're creating more of a fake inclusiveness because it's not really inclusive. And I've seen that from time to time again, where there will be teachers who really want to have a critical bent to their work, and they mention sexual identity, they mention gender identity, but there's no unpacking of the heteronormative nature of those schools. And so that's where we want to go a little more deeper as to, where does that exclusion come from? Where does the erasure come from? And why does it have to be that way? So moving on, I just wanted to highlight, that's the frame of what I wanted to talk about for today, based on what you've read. I do have some references right there, and I think yes, and then we'll just move on. Anyways, that's fine, that's it for today, but we'll move on to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Robert. Over to you, Dan.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Robert. Let me just tell the audience, explain to the audience, Robert, that many of the participants of the research group are here, but also teachers and professors from all over the country. So I'm asking everyone to fill the form, the registration form, and I will send Robert's text and my text, the text that were discussed earlier. Okay, guys? so we can send you the text. It's also in a handbook that I will comment right now. Mi, pode tirar do Robert. Posso fazer daqui a minha apresentação? Can I do from here? Michelle? Oh, Michelle. Oh, Michelle, what happened? Let's see. I'm going to do it from here. And let's see if this is working. So my 10 minutes, let's see. So I'd like to start thanking, of course, Professor Robert Mizzi and Professor Joe Windle for being here with us. We were talking in the backstage, communicating, and at least for us, this is such an important topic in applied linguistics, in teacher education, in language education, in education in general. However, at least for me, and especially now in Brazil, it seems like an act of courage, to be talking about this. Sometimes we feel afraid, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't, because at least from my experience, students they are willing. They want to discuss these topics. So for my introduction, I'd like to talk about two books. The first one is The Critical Concepts in Queer Studies and Education. I will talk a little bit about this, and then I'll move on to the second book, Language Education and the University, Fostering Socially Just Practices in Undergraduate Contexts. Okay? So I'll start with this first quote, which is very interesting to me. It's from the book, if I'm not mistaken. It's from the chapter I will discuss in a moment. The Discursive and Performative Promise of Queer Theory, Genderification, the chapter I will talk about. The discursive and performative promise of queer theory has not, by and large, made its way into either primary or secondary schools, and trans teachers in particular are bearing witness to that deficit today. While the rainbow diversity of queer students may experience a warm and fuzzy flood of the It Gets Better project, it's probably many of you know this project, encouragement. For more on this, see Harris and Farrington. Visibly and performatively, queer teachers, including trans ones, remain marginalized as ever. So I'm not going to anticipate one of my answers, but I feel a connection to this as a queer educator, as a gay professor, because this is something that at the same time I see that the subject has been discussed. We, like in Brazil, especially in São Paulo, we see gay couples walking around hand in hand, which was not possible when I was young, when I was a young adult. But at the same time, I don't think that education or these studies, the topics, the subject, the discussion have reached schools. So this is the book, the first book I'd like to talk about. So what is it's very interesting, because I don't know if you can see, I don't know if it's too small, but anyways, I can talk about it. So the book is all about keywords, so critical concepts. And what is interesting is that there is a chapter from Robert here that he has just talked about it. What is interesting about this book is that from each keyword, the author or the authors, they are interweaving, they are connecting the keyword to queer theory, or their reading and their interpretation of queer theories and education. So very interesting. I can, it's on the internet, but I can send you the book. And so you have many critical concepts there. And the one that I the passages that I'd like to talk to is from this chapter, Genderification, and it's the context of the whole debate on the keyword of genderification. It starts with the chapter starts with a poem. So this poem was written and performed by one of the students, Charlie Gross, at the California State University, where the authors were teaching performance studies. And Charlie, she chose to stage her work in a public bathroom. So she invited all the students to follow her, go to the bathroom, and then she read this poem. That little white symbol, that little white symbol, that little white person against the blue background, it makes me sick. I can't even bring myself to accept that it represents a woman. How could something that is supposed to represent me cause me so much pain? It is a fucking sign. I stand there outside the door, and almost every time I fight myself about going in. I can hold it, at least until the class is over, until the next break, until I get home. This battle with myself is painful, daily practice. It has come down to mind over bladder. Finally, I just go in. I see that the room is full of people that had no struggle, just like I just did. Full of people that are already participating in my anguish, full of rude stares, snide remarks, full of gasps and ohs, full of judgment, full of assumptions that I am some perverted person, some unthinkable monster. This is the lady's room. I am a lady. She laughs as she walks out. She doesn't even know I am a sorority girl, just like she is. A few seconds of peace until I face this room of pain once again. I get up, go out to a group of new judgmental faces. I stare at myself in the mirror as I try to feel normal in this room full of my difference. Excuse me? I finally escape. No matter how many times I tell myself and everyone else who I am, I'm faced with this every day, telling me that everything a woman should be is everything I'm not. So now I live my life fighting to be recognized as a woman who can be herself. I am a woman, I am a lesbian, I am a butch, and I am beautiful. I can hold it. So after reading this poem and the whole chapter, I kept thinking about my LGBT students here in São Paulo, at the University of São Paulo. And this poem was really made me think about when we think about all of these experiences, the queer experience, the LGBT students, have my students been afraid? Have my students been proud of their genders and their sexualities? Have my students been respected? Have my students been represented? Have my students been given a chance to talk? And what have my students been? How have their experiences been here at the university, but mainly in my classes, in my courses? So, and then I started thinking about, would I have a similar project? Would I have something to share, or something maybe to try to answer these questions that I've been asking myself? And I know it's not a similar project, but I'd like to share with you with a little bit of relief because after I thought about sharing this project, well, at least I've been trying to answer these questions together with my students, along with my students. So this is the book that we have just published. It's Professor Ana Paula Duboc and myself, Language Education and the University, Fostering Socially Just Practices in Undergraduate Context. Joe, I'm about to finish, okay? It's just the book, and then it's done. So this book is the result of students' response papers This is a kind of evaluation that I learned in Canada with Professor Diana Bryden from the University of Manitoba. Like having students write response papers to the course, to the contents, to the authors, but never forgetting their voices. They have to include their subjectivities. So the result of this project, and I'm very proud to share it with you after all of those questions in mind. So after we finished the term, let's say, I invited the students to work on their response papers, expand, turn it into something academic, turn it into academic chapters. And then I had like almost 30 students participating in this project. So these are some of the chapters. I think Michele, can you share the link? Because it's Creative Commons license, so it's free. It's an ebook. So you have there neoliberalism, language, emoji, the language of emojis. You have digital literacies. I'm sorry, maybe it's too small, but I can read. Discourse, studies and literature in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Here we have Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and Chimamanda. Here we have fandom, two students talking about fandom, Giovanna and Samuel. We have like chapters on politics, power, and discourse. And guys, let me tell you something. I'm talking about undergraduate students, okay, who could never think maybe that they would publish something. I mean, many of their papers, they send them to the professors, and then they get a grade, and that's it. So it's a very, very interesting book, at least to me. So here you have Douglas talking about the yellow peril and minority. He's talking about Asians here. And here, just to finish my very brief introduction, some chapters related to the topics we're discussing today. So again, students chose what they wanted to write about in the discipline, in the course, language and culture, discourse studies, semantics, and then they turned it into a chapter. So this one is from Vito Kenzo, Discourse Studies and Literature in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. This one is from Mateus Jardim, The Contemporary Novel and the Matter of Queer Visibility in the Era of Neoliberalism. This one is from Raquel Getz, Lesbian Discourse as a Form of Social Transformation. And Raquel, I hope you're there because that poem was in honor to you. And Túlio Balestreiro, The Power of Political Discourses, Focus on Gender and Homosexuality. And to finish, A Ska That Does Not Cease to Throb, Beauty and Masculinity Ideals Within the Gay Male Community by Lucas Cardoso Miquelon. So this is what I had to say. I'm not reading this because I talked about the project of the book. And thank you very much. Let me stop sharing.
Daniel. Oops. I'm going to ask the first question then. I had as my first year lecturer at Melbourne University, Anna Maria Jagos, mentioned by Robert. So I can already reveal that as my introduction to queer theory. She had just published her first book, Queer Theory and Introduction. And it was the early days of queer theory. So I think it would be interesting to see if you guys think that there's been shifts in the field since that time as well. So I will hand over to you, Robert, first, and then over to Danielle.
Sure. Like, I mean, my introduction to queer theory, like yours, came through my graduate school programming as well. And I took an actual course on queer theory that was when I was at York University in Toronto, which is very much a left of center university, very much pro-queer, pro any type of exploration of identity. So it was very, it was the right place to be at. It was a little bit unfortunate that I wasn't introduced to queer theory into my graduate programming. I feel like if I had it in my teacher education in my undergraduate, that may actually would have set my teaching career into a whole different realm, because maybe I would be able to disturb some of the practices that I was engaged with as a queer teacher in the K-12 sector. K-12 meaning kindergarten to grade 12, which is what we say in Canada for elementary and secondary school. And so anyways, but looking back, I mean, it was really rich to see some talk about disrupting the identity binaries, the normativities, and exploring the whole concept of performativity in general through Judith Butler's work, because I felt like that was a really good way to resist and provide some sort of resistance to the hegemonic behaviors that I was experiencing as a queer teacher, but also in general, wherever I move and interrupt and kind of engage within any type of social situations. And so I think that helped me develop my whole concept around heteroprofessionalism. And that really came out of my research, where I have queer educators who were saying to me, both during my research, but also externally too, because of my network, saying how they were told that they were unprofessional because of their sexuality, expressions of their same-sex relationships, expressions of their queerness. And that really resonated with me. And I really do feel there's a relationship there between heteronormativity and professionalism, as I explored just earlier. So I think queer theory does influence. It does allow us to think broader, think about ways that it can impact our lives, and then attach ourselves to whoever we're really affiliated with. I mean, I love the work of Michel Foucault, for example, and his work around governmentality and sexual regulation and such. And so I kind of like to, I guess, I date around. It's an open relationship with queer theorists, and that's okay. I'll pass it over to Daniel for a comment.
Yes, thank you. So very interesting, Robert, because my story is a little bit different. I started studying like LGBT studies and education, and I didn't even know how huge it was in Brazil, actually, because we from the, let's say, the modern languages, this is my impression, we don't touch these issues. But the education in Portuguese, for example, we have many scholars. But I'd like to share with you my trigger. Like, I was a professor at the Faculty of Technology. Now, pay attention to this story. I was because it has a lot to do with the heteroprofessionalism. I am your case study, Robert, because I was a professor at the Faculty of Technology here in São Paulo, and so I was basically teaching technology courses. As you can imagine, a very heteronormative, I would say a very macho environment, because I had classrooms of 40 students, and 39 were boys and one were girl, or man and one woman. So, and up to that point, I was trying to remember the dates. It was 2007. So up to 2007, I was silencing. I used to silence this, my identity, because of professional reasons. Like at the Faculty of Technology, we could not even have personal contact with students at that time. So I'm talking about some years, but not a long time ago. if the students wanted to talk to professors, they had to go to the reception or something and write a message, and so there was no WhatsApp, or they could not even have our emails, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, that was 2007. And then one day I was teaching English, probably for information technology, or one of the courses. And it was, I remember very clearly, it was a Monday after the Gay Pride in São Paulo. And our Gay Pride is one of the biggest in the world. So it's very famous. It's, very well known. A lot of people come. 3 million people have already joined the Gay Pride. And then I start my class, and then the students start making jokes, to one another. Teacher, this one, he went to the Gay Pride. Oh, this one, he went to the Gay Pride. Hey, teacher, did you go to the Gay Pride? Of course they were talking about me. This is the impression I had. They were talking about me, like, aren't you going to say anything? We are questioning you. You're questioning your sexuality, and I remember the feeling. I got so frustrated because I didn't do anything. Because of institutional pressure, because of lack of education, lack of preparation. But I remember all this, these feelings, almost blushing, like looking at the board. And then it was the night class, and I went home really, really, really frustrated. I said, how come I didn't do anything? It was the first time in my life. I had been a teacher and professor for more than 15 years already at that time, and I had never realized how I was silencing myself and how I was trying to be another professional. Like, here I'm the English teacher, so this identity is out. But that was a turning point in my life. That class was a turning point in my life, because I said, I cannot be like that. I cannot accept being like that. I don't care about this institution. I have to do something. So then I prepared a class, and then I started my next class with a very short video of a child talking to a gay couple for a first time. I think it got viral. And then I talked to them. I said, look, I couldn't answer last week, but I'd like to start the class talking about this. Yes, I went to the Gay Parade. It was very nice, a beautiful party. You have to know more, blah, 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 blah. I just, I just spoke, and then it was really, really. And then I decided to cut the story short, I decided to do a postdoctorate in teacher education, language education, and LGBT studies, queer studies. So I decided to study more so that I could get more prepared, but also talk to teachers if they had the same experience as I did,
Thanks, Danielle. I'm going to throw it.
I don't know if Robert would like to comment on my comment.
That's
and then
exactly what I was going to do, Danielle. Don't steal my role.
Or even Joe. Joe, if you want to comment on our comments, or maybe, yeah.
That's okay. Yes, I will ask Robert to comment then about your narrative there.
And thanks so much, Daniel. And that is exactly where I feel like you were working within an environment that did not really foster or support your queer identity. You were kind of a product of your space, in a sense. And myself, as when I was teaching elementary school, I would deepen my voice and I'd hold my hands close to me, and I would try to be as hyper masculine as I could. And doing that every day throughout the day for 8 hours, it's a long time and it's a lot of work. And so I try to ask students, to try to get a sense of what that is like. I ask my students to say, describe your weekend without using the gender of the person that you're spending time with. And just that simple exercise, they get to realize how much their lives are gendered and how that impacts their language and their interactions and such. And I feel like that's one way of getting around it. But I also feel like we need to have administrators really on board with understanding and supporting queer realities, because the queer teacher, I believe, is one of the most marginalized groups within the queer community, simply because if they're interacting with children and youth, there's a set of assumptions that you saw with the images earlier that could be very disturbing, very upsetting. And so therefore, they're much more silenced than what they would be perhaps in another type of profession. And so this is where we need to be aware of these power dynamics in the workplace and how it affects queerness.
Robert, sorry, could you talk about the activity again? You asked the students to describe a weekend?
Yep. Let's describe their weekend without using the gender of the person they're interacting with.
Very interesting.
And then they've got to start using partner. They have to really focus on the word. And I thought, well, that's what it's like, as someone who's in the closet as a queer person, because we always have to be careful about the gender and the activity so that we're not quickly identified as such. So it could be like a masquerade of sorts.
Thanks, Robert. So, Danielle, would you like to comment a bit more maybe about what as a queer teacher you can do to promote that kind of shift in understandings and consciousness that you briefly mentioned, and then Robert gave an example of with that activity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about this when I was preparing myself for this event. And let me just yeah. So I don't have one answer, but I have some ideas. The first one is negotiation. I think this is very important because when I was doing my postdoctorate, I had this experience. I have just shared with the group, with the study group 2 hours before. I had one of my students. He just stood up and left the room, because he said, I'm not here to talk about the things. I'm here to learn, language and this kind of thing. So I think one of the things for me, one of the elements would be the negotiation. Another thing that I do, even though here at the University of São Paulo, it's really I feel as I talk to them. That it's really, really okay. It's not a taboo anymore. So within this university level, the teacher education level, I don't think it's a taboo, but I cannot speak for the whole country. But I think we can negotiate the curriculum with them, ask them to tell us what they would like to study. And as you could see in the book that I have just edited with Ana Paula Duboc, they chose these themes. So they want to talk about this. They're willing to talk. So you see, and then there's a hint. When this doesn't happen, like I don't know, for many reasons. From time to time, I bring materials that will, bring up this discussion. So a video, a music trailer, the trailer of a music clip or something like that, or texts. So I'm always bringing different things, and I'm always paying attention to the inclusion of gender differences, sexualities, to use this as material for language analysis, for linguistic analysis. I do that a lot in discourse analysis, for example, discursive studies, semantics, You can do this in semantic class. So from time, I'm not saying that we have to queer the whole curriculum. I think we should, but anyways, I'm not saying that we have to make it like every class, but I think that from time to time you bring the discussion, you offer them this possibility, and students, they do it. They join us and they bring their identities, they bring their narratives, their stories. Sometimes we cry in the classroom because it's so emotional, but I think it's worth it. So number one, negotiation. I think negotiation of curriculum, of contents. And if this is not possible, I think it's the teacher job, using Biesta's idea of the pedagogy of interruption, but not like a shocking interruption. Oh, come on, you're going to study what I want you to study. No, from time to time you bring some subtle ideas, and maybe I can share in the chat some of the, or send. I can send through email for the participants many of the activities that I've been doing, the materials, the videos, the YouTube videos. They're all online, and they are very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Not only to offer the possibility of discussion for the queer students, for the LGBT students, and we have a lot of them in languages courses, especially in the modern languages, in the English undergraduate, but also for those who are heterosexuals, for those who are, and for all of the possible gender sexuality combination. Because let me tell you something, Joe, it's very complex for me. Even today, I talk to my niece, and she explains a lot of things to me. She's 17 years old. She said, hey, uncle, no, now it's like this. My friend, I said, really, Louisa, it's like this now. So the young generations, they're also constantly transforming something that cannot be fixed, which is gender and sexuality.
Thanks, Danielle. Robert, you raised an interesting point, which is that, as individual teachers, we're often fairly exposed. And so, we rely on support from other groups or from students. I'm going to ask you a question from the audience. Maybe you can comment about those wider support communities and so on as part of that. So the question is from Tamara, which is how can we approach heteroprofessionalism in English teaching environments?
Sure. English language education isn't quite my area, but I think I can extrapolate some themes that could be useful. When you're coming across any type of introducing some sort of case study with the students for them to understand, so different types of professions, for example, different types of jobs, and what are the skills associated with that, where are the values, that's where you can kind of enter into a space where you can explore sexual and gender difference in general. And that's where you could portray, for example, why not have someone who identifies as transgender working as a nurse, for example, or having a lesbian teacher or a gay male doctor? So you're playing with the texts that underline and the messages that's coming through the texts, whether it's kind of consciously or unconsciously in a certain way. But that's where you can get to some sort of unpacking as to what are some of the assumptions. When you think about, for example, of doctor, who comes to mind? What gender comes to mind? What color of skin comes to mind? What does that person look like? Everything about that. And then you introduce some of the differences through your case examples, just to disrupt some of those assumptions. That's really a good starting point, I feel. But then whenever you're exploring language around policy, for example, texts and programs and such, that's where you can start to fold in, again, some of that more queer inclusive language, working with gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation, just to try to bring in how that language could be very powerful and very meaningful to not only queer people, but I think to heterosexual people as well. And we start to realize that there are different types of families, there are different types of social groups, there's different types of friendships and such. And that's useful. That's useful knowledge, and that we're not just presenting the material through a heteronormative standpoint is really helpful, I think, and so that we can just start to just create some disruptions. So that's maybe a question I would start off with. I think Daniel spoke really well to that. But how can I disrupt? You know, you're looking at here's the curriculum, here's what you need to teach. How can I disrupt this? To try to challenge assumptions and deconstruct some of those normative behaviors and deconstruct some of those regulations that are taking place within schools, systems, and other places. And that's where I think it could be very helpful.
Joe, can I
Yeah,
comment?
please.
Yeah, Robert. Here in Brazil, one of the questions that students ask me, ask me all the time is like, but Daniel, I work in let's say in a language school, in a private language school, and in my school, I cannot do anything. I just have to open the book and teach the book, etc. So my answer is always, guys, okay, you have to follow the book. Like this activity you just shared with us. It's something very simple. You know, you're not changing anything. You're not changing the status quo. You're just like, you know, doing it, you know, like embedded, let's say. But you're asking students for a composition. You guys, write about your weekend. The only challenge is no gender. You have to use, remember we learned the pronouns, so now you have to use, so you see what I mean? And then you're doing an educational work, thinking about diversity without even having to tell your coordinator, oh, you know, I'm raising the flag. So I think, at least in Brazil, we have to be very creative, but there are many possibilities. For example, I always start my class with something. Like in the communicative approach, they used to call it like warm up, but it's always something to break the previous atmosphere. Let's say that they come from work and etc. But it's always something critical and productive, inviting them to start the class thinking about something. It can be a poem, a piece of news. It can be a video, music, a film scene, you know. So I think the teacher has a lot of opportunities. And if you're doing this, even if you are in a very strict language center, you can tell your coordinator, no, you know, oh my God, this is being recorded. Okay, you can say, you know, I was just doing a warm-up. And because of the coronavirus pandemic, I decided to bring this, you know, piece of news. Because that gay boy was killed, I decided it was important. But you know, it's in English. My class is in English. The news is in English. So I think, of course, it requires a lot of creativity and preparation. And I saw Lucas here in the chat. Lucas and everyone, I can of course share all of the materials that I've been collecting and using. But at the same time, I really think it's not impossible, let's say, even with very strict context. But I don't know if I'm correct, because of course each one has their own struggles and of course.
Yeah, and if I could respond, Joel, if you don't mind. I think it does take moral courage to do this work, and that's so. And sometimes it has to be incremental, so that you can, you know, bring along administration with you in this journey, and it takes several years sometimes, you know, just to get things going where you could be inclusive. I love your example of just starting off with something, and whenever we're steep in with these political contexts and environments, sometimes we have to kind of use that as a pedagogical tool. For example, why not show an image of two men kissing, for example, and then you show a picture of children in poverty and question, why are there so many protests against the gay man kissing that we see out in the world, in so many countries, yet we don't see protests about why are children living in poverty and why are they poor and why are they going hungry? We don't see that movement happening. And so really questioning the assumptions and the normative behaviors around being within a political context in general can be very, very useful and a good pedagogical tool just to start the process of just questioning. And that's a very critical pedagogical approach, but still it's very useful.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just read some more questions here, folks, from the audience? One's got a comment and a question from Mr. Albert. As a gay English teacher here in Brasilia, I have suffered bullying from some other colleagues. What are your ideas about it? How can we survive this sick environment? Let me read a couple of others before I throw it back to you. This one for Dr. Mizzi. Do you believe the idea of professionalism could be considered as some kind of technology of power or control mechanism aimed at creating docile bodies in the school? And one last one from Dr. Valkyria. Do you see a project for controlling society through the ideology of modernity, that being dissemination of a written language, reading and writing using standardized norms, as useful for control over society using the rules of homogeneity? Robert, over to you.
Okay. Excellent questions. And, we could definitely write a thesis on each one of those questions, but I think I may tackle one, and then maybe Daniel, you can jump in on one, and then we'll move on to the second one. Is that all right with you? Great. Okay. So gay bullying as a teacher, and certainly something I can connect with, and so many people in my research and in my networks can certainly, in Canada as well. And we are considered one of the most progressive countries for LGBT rights in the world, and yet we still have this as an issue. This is where policy is really helpful, to help, support the teacher, to say this is anti-discrimination policies, school diversity policies. Those all come into play here whenever there's bullying. If you're unionized, a union should certainly be very much involved in this context as well. Now, if you don't have any of those supports, this is where you have to start thinking about first your own safety. And I'm really concerned about your mental health as a queer teacher being bullied continually from your colleagues. And this is, you may need to consider if you're at a loss and there's not going to be any change after you've spoken to the administration, the union, anybody that could be of support to you within those authority roles, then you have to consider your own safety into consider leaving and switching to another job, and perhaps another job, but perhaps another school that's more supportive. And hopefully through your professional networks, you'll know of those schools that will be helpful to you. But also this speaks to the wider need for activism in the community to create change. And because we have these cases still ongoing, and we won't have that change until we have the legal and the policy frameworks on board with supporting diversity in the schools. And that diversity needs to stipulate sexual and gender diversity. So that's my reaction, and I think Daniel, you may have some other ideas there too. But it is certainly it is a terrible situation when we have queer teachers feeling bullied. Absolutely.
Yeah, very, very similar. Thanks, Robert. Mr. Albert, the first thing I'd like to tell you, it's you are not alone. You're definitely not alone. This has been going on in Brazil, and it's worse now, as we know. And I don't think it's going to get better for the next 2 years. So I think Robert's advice and comments are the ones that I agree with. But I also think that something important is to create, to build up a net of emotional support. So this is something we have to get united. You know, we LGBTs, teachers, educators, and everything. This is something really, really important, because if we want to fight for something to happen in schools, if we want the administrators to be educators so that they can punish this kind of attitude just like any other, we need to, you know, to get united and start supporting each other in these very difficult moments, so that we realize that we are not alone, because it's hard, it's not easy, but when you have this net of support, you will realize that not that it's an excuse, but it's something so much bigger than us. It's something historical. It's something that, you know, we have to fight a lot in order to change. Like Robert said, it takes years for us to change, you know, this drop of the ocean when we talk about gender and sexualities, especially in Brazil. It's a very difficult moment. So I think that creating this net of emotional support is really important, so that you have friends to count on, to share this experience and maybe minimize it. You know, like this other person that is doing this to you, as hard as it can be, this is stupid person. You know, like somebody who knows nothing about diversity, relationships, human beings, and, you know, so you kind of minimize that. I'm not saying we're not going to suffer. We suffer a lot, but maybe to invert the game. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Valkyria Monchimore made an interesting and important comment. That is, we've had some great victories, particularly in Brazil, if we recall the recent history of the dictatorship and education under the military regime. So I think, you know, as well as the current adversity, it's important for us to remember the victories that we've had. And one important point, I think, is that when there's conflict, it means there's already some disruption. And an example of that at the moment is the debate over inclusive language, gender neutral language and gender inclusive language, which in the field of language and literacy studies in Brazil has become a kind of a hot debate, but also amongst political circles, with a proposal for a law banning gender inclusive language in schools, protecting so-called heritage of Brazilian Portuguese. So Robert, maybe you could comment, is there anything in Canada in terms of government adoption or rejection of gender inclusive language? Is that part of the debates there? And then Dan, can you comment on that too, please?
No, we've moved on, which I think same-sex marriage, when that came into play, that helped a great deal with changing the focus now toward inclusive language. And we've just now passed in our human rights legislation, gender identity and gender expression, which means someone cannot be discriminated against just for their gender identity, so being transgender, but as well as if they're expressing their gender in a non-conformity way, they cannot be discriminated against. But that takes time for practice and for people to understand what that legislation is about too. I think it's very progressive and very useful, but we want to make sure that society comes along with the legislation too, or else people still may not report that they've been discriminated against or had some sort of experience with violence, and that's an issue. And so why aren't they reporting? What's wrong with the police? What's wrong with other school districts or administration that they're not being welcoming and supportive there? So I think that what's kind of we need more work on, I think, is more the context piece. So with new immigrant populations coming into Canada from countries that are very homophobic, they are transphobic, that's where they're carrying those values around and across into Canada. And so we need to have some sort of education piece of say what's done in Canada that's different, as well as we need to look at in rural areas where there's a staunch conservatism at times. And I don't mean to be homogenize the rural area, because there could be some very progressive pieces too. But that's generally speaking, that's where there could be some sort of areas where we need more pedagogy and more kind of adult education in general. So I think we, on paper, we look good, but in practice, we have a lot more work to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think here it's pretty much the same. I was looking at this was Clarissa's suggestion, right? Clarissa's comments, and I see this discussion a lot on Facebook, and I see people fighting. Well, my perspective, I see people fighting over the right to let's say to almost like a brand, like I am the one who wrote about this. This is my impression, and I think this is useless. At the same time, this bill, this project, it's very outright, it's very conservative. And why is that? Because eventually they are fighting gender diversity. They are fighting sexuality differences. This is what they're doing. So they're trying to do that. This kind of government proposals and bills. I don't know if they have passed. I love all kinds of I use all of them. Clarissa, and I'm learning, and I think Portuguese is very creative, this in terms of this inclusive language, people bringing their own the ways they want to be, let's say, represented, the way they want to be called. So do I have a right to be called the way I like to be called? Of course I do. So I love all the prezades, the prezadas, prezados. I think it's very fruitful and very enriching. Academically speaking, like the linguistic part of it, I haven't studied. I haven't read anything. But I mean, as a social practice, I think it's very, very enriching. Yeah. And it's a good debate in Brazil because a lot of linguists and applied linguists and educators, all of them are trying to say, no, but this is my field. No, this is my field. No, this is me. But I think like and we should fight this kind of laws because they are not even, well, they're not written by any specialist, let's say. It's just somebody who decided. Those people who think they don't have ideology, they criticize gender ideology, they've never read it, they don't know what they're talking about, but they try to do this because they're trying to whatever, and communism, socialism, all of the things so how can you connect all this? Well, they can do it. They can do it because it's bizarre talk. It's nonsense talk. It's just like that.
So, Danielle, I think that's, a big feature of Brazil currently is that climate of the culture wars where particularly right-wing groups have picked up on the terrain of culture and education as being new battlefields. And I wonder if in Canada, the political discourse may be different, if the discourse of tolerance and multiculturalism is open to being appropriated by conservative or homophobic projects, or how does that what's the state of political discourse around that in Canada?
Well, multiculturalism is a very problematic discourse, particularly for Indigenous people, because all of a sudden they got subsumed into this legal framework that is from a colonial power. And so that there's an interesting debate and good reason to remove Indigenous people and out of that whole discourse around multiculturalism, because they are the first people of Canada, so therefore they deserve special status within Canada. What I find is problematic with multiculturalism, again, is that it looks at a lot of visual culture, so racialized cultures in general, but queer culture has often been left out of that whole discourse. It's like we're not really a culture, so therefore we're not part of that whole multiculturalism legislation, and that's problematic. That just speaks to heteronormativity, because not only that is people who are, of course, of racialized backgrounds also have sexual identities and gender identities, and so when you divorce race from sexuality and gender, then you've got a problem, because you've got just a very, very myopic, a very, very narrow view of what is construction as race. And I was one of the first people who've done research around queer immigrant educators coming into Canada. And one of my participants said to me, I get invited, he gets invited all the time to do research as a queer immigrant because it's a hot topic. However, he says, what I appreciate about your study is that we want to look at what do we do at work? And that, because 80% of our time is spent at work. And he appreciated that nod to try to make their work lives a little bit more easier. And in that particular case, the participant was from Jordan. And if you're called gay or lesbian in Jordan, it's seen as a taboo practice. It's seen as it's hurled as an insult. It's just not done. Here he comes to Canada, and he says, well, I have a male partner, and that's just who I am. So he wasn't really using the word gay, but then he's being assigned the term gay because he has the same-sex sexuality. So I think there's a problem there when we start compartmentalizing identity, which I think has connections to the Multiculturalism Act within Canada, that we start compartmentalizing. And then as soon as we look at queer identities, again, we continue on with that practice, because the people who are receiving those identities have to make sense in their world. And that's fairly patriarchal in some ways. I feel like it has to be more so. We have to understand the lives of people who come into Canada, who are born in Canada, and understand that, and give them the voice, amplify their voice, so that we learn, not that we're not imprinting our own ways of organizing and making sense of identity in general. So that's the issue around multiculturalism in Canada. So I'm trying to get it not so heteronormative, moving forward.
I think that in Brazil, Joe, it's quite different, I guess, because even though we have been studying, at least in academia, multiculturalism, and even questioning the term, as I know Valkyria is there, and I learned this with Valkyria, this idea that the multi, this prefix multi, it already brings the idea of multiplicity, but it's a multicultural in which there is no, let's say, this real exchange. It's multicultural because you are there, and then you are there, and you are there, and you are there. Now, even this perspective, I think, is something better than what we are experiencing here in Brazil, because we're experiencing the mono vision, and this mono vision is my vision, and this is why it is so difficult for us to talk about multiculturalism or trans culture or anything. Well, it's difficult to talk about culture itself because culture is being closed down. So I think it's a very difficult scenario right now, and we have to register, because I don't know, people who will watch this, like, hopefully who will watch this like 2 years, in 2 years time, or 3 years, 4 years time, hopefully things will be different and better. Because with this idea of the monoculture, like, I mean, my culture is the one that is to be considered. And if you do not belong to my group, take, like Robert said, take the indigenous, what's going on to the indigenous communities in Brazil, not to mention all the ecological stuff going around. So it's almost like a tragedy, really. I've never seen such a thing. Of course, there have been ups and downs, but this idea that we should have just one culture, which goes back to the global north, the European project for modernity of the world. Okay, it goes back, but it goes back like hundreds of years back in time, because we're going back to the idea of the monoculture, the monovision, this idea of one nation, one religion, one. But there is a difference. It has to be my culture, my religion, my nation, my language. Otherwise, you're out. And this is why this debate is important. We need to restate time and again that we are here and we exist and we're doing things. Okay, when we're talking about queer educators, for example, what are you going to do? Are you going to ignore us, or what are you going to do? Are you going to send us away? So you see, so this idea of the multiculturalism, even though it's complicated already, but I think it's something much better than these monovisions that we are experiencing right now. We are not talking about multiculturalism in Brazil right now. I think, at least the mass media, governmental decisions and actions and projects and etc. Even in terms of culture. I don't know if I have answered your question or if you have something to complement.
I'm going to ask another question from the audience here, probably for you, Danielle, from Francisco Jr. I always work with students who are starting to learn English. Most of them are adults. How can I approach these subjects? The discussion in Portuguese and the activities and texts in English. What do you suggest, Danielle?
I see. From what I understand, it must be something like a beginner's level, something like that, the basic level, isn't it? I see. Okay, I get the point. So, Francisco, again, the choice of materials, I think it's really important. Sometimes, like Robert said, you just bring two images, like visual literacy. You just bring two images, and if you are within this teaching learning paradigm in which you have to speak English all the time, students can, so okay, if you have to do that, and you cannot use Portuguese in classes, for example, because some schools still do that, you can ask the student to, I'm going to send you guys this activity. I even have the PowerPoint with all the images that I do. You ask the students to write one word, okay? So using the image, for example, like Robert said, you bring poverty, or you bring something connected to the topic of the day, to the unit, but at the same time you bring other images. You don't bring just the restaurant or the food. You bring those who cannot afford to buy food. You bring those, you see what I mean? And even if they don't have like language level, or they're not proficient enough, they write a word. What do you see? And this is something interesting. This is a visual literacy activity that I like very much. The only rule is you cannot write what is there, let's say, the description of that image. You see what I mean? Are you following me? You have to make an interpretation of that image. So this is one very simple activity. And by doing that, you can choose the images. So you can mix, okay? It's basic level. Why not two men having breakfast or having a romantic dinner? It's food, it's restaurant, but the image speaks for itself. Let's say you're bringing something for them to think about. It's not a heteronormative couple. It's not a man and a woman. Are you following me? So like this deconstructions, disruptions, if it's not possible because of the school, because of the institution, because of the rules, for you to do something else. But many schools in Brazil nowadays, you're able to do something more educational, more critical, more formative, let's say, and then you can do many other things. You can, so I see the difficulty was language perhaps, but you can start with very simple things. Like using Google Dictionary, writing words or writing sentences and then read aloud, these kind of things. But you have to, I mean, the creative and the critical side needs to be there. Thinking about the objective of your class. Okay, in this class, you're talking about families or restaurants or food or traveling. Would you like to include this in your class because there was a joke, there was a homophobic joke last class, which was my case that I shared with you? So then do it, but don't lose your job. Do it creatively.
Danielle, I think, in the question, there's an issue about, the choice of a teaching strategy, but also that danger of being, losing professional credibility if you stray from what is seen as relevant. And as English teachers, we know the expectation in Brazil is to use English only. And if we use Portuguese, students or colleagues or ourselves may feel like we are not performing as English teachers, that it's not relevant, or that it's some kind of distraction. And when it's a topic that the teacher has a personal connection to, if it's a Black teacher talking about race or a gay teacher talking about sexuality, then the threat is even greater, right, to our professional credibility. And I think, as an English teacher in Brazil who's a native speaker, then of course that issue about credibility is asked less than a Brazilian teacher or a Black Brazilian teacher of English, where the professional credibility is always under greater scrutiny. So on that topic, I wonder if I can just return to an earlier question about professionalism as a kind of technology of power or a control mechanism aimed at creating docile bodies in school.
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful question, and thank you, Tiago, for asking it. When I was working through the professionalism literature first, there are two camps. There's the camp that says it's necessary to control, and then there's the camp that says that's a problem that you need to control. and that's where I align myself with, where I can appreciate that you want to have a sense of order within the classroom and in the school and sense, but when people are feeling marginalized, then we've got a problem. And that's where I think professionalism has been used as a technology of power, drawing on a Foucauldian lens here to control people. Like when you're hearing statements like that's unprofessional, and that word professional is not clearly defined within any type of code of conduct, a diversity policy, or even just a code of professionalism in general, like something created for that purpose, then we've got a problem, because people can just hurl that anytime at any point and try to control another person. And what it does is that it creates a sense of fear within the subject, within the person, to say, oh my goodness, you mean I can't wear this outfit, or I can't wear this, I can't eat this food, or I can't introduce my queerness in this way, and that's a sense of fear, because people don't want to be targeted in the workplace or be at risk for losing their job or anything like that. And so it is a control mechanism. And it's really rooted, I believe, if you look back into Foucault, some of the governmentality work that he's introduced, I think that you will see some parallels there, where we have to confess and be dependent on the state to give us what we're looking for, but we have very little agency in a sense. And they create these rules and regulations in order to control us. I think there's certainly some connection there that we need to consider. And I think professionalism is just one of those technologies. I think there's several other technologies that's a part of governmentality, but we need to have it more clearly defined in order, if we're able to create a space that's more welcoming and supportive, and people aren't feeling so much a threat or afraid to break the norm. If that makes sense.
Joe, let me just go back to the previous comments and questions from Francisco, because I had one more insight. Going back to this issue of using or not, including or not in pedagogical practices, I think it's the teacher's choice. Okay, we shouldn't be, under pressure to start planning classes tomorrow and doing it because somebody said so. You know what I mean? It's a very subjective process. You getting to know yourself better as a teacher. You get that with maturity as well as a teacher educator. Okay, to get to know the right moment, the context, the institution. You can do that because just like you said, Joe, you're not going to be fired. For this is not the case. I think it's important to point out that we are not saying here that overnight you become a queer educator, especially in contexts like Brazil. It is a process of self-knowledge, self-instruction, self-preparation. So, and I'd like to say this: if you make your reflections, and tomorrow you're preparing your classes, and you see that this is not possible now, just don't do it. Otherwise you're going to be fired. Like this idea, the Tamara's question now, we have to be aware that we might lose our jobs if we do something different from the professionalism, and on top of that, heteroprofessionalism. So we have to be aware of these contexts in order to prepare our classes, to educate, etc. So sometimes it's good, to take a step back and just be okay. This is what I think. And when it's possible, like probably Joe, Robert, and we're very privileged to be in universities, educating teachers, future educators, future pedagogues. And this is a privilege. We always have to pinpoint that it's not everybody has the same privilege of choosing content, negotiating curriculum, etc., content with students, activities, dynamics. So we have to be very aware of and this goes back to Paulo Freire's idea of the first thing you need to know when you start educating is the context. The history and the context. You cannot start without this. You cannot start without this. So you have to know that your time, the historical time, and also the context. Your students, the school, the institution, they pay your job. So I'd like to complement this. But otherwise, I didn't want to leave this with the impression that we're raising the flag, that you always have to do it. Do we start doing it now? I think we should. But we know that we have very different contexts: educational, life, work, civic contexts, right?
And there was another related question about modernity, the role of school in as part of the project of modernity through teaching standards in reading and writing, as well as perhaps teaching other forms of obedience. And I guess related to that, the wider idea of modernity as a project of European rationality and enlightenment. And I wonder whether, in your view, queer theory has really grappled with coloniality, given its, its origins in the concerns of North America and Europe. That's open to both of you guys.
Again, a good thesis right there. But I would.
Yes, tough questions.
Yeah, actually, I am writing a paper right now on decolonial queer theory because queer theory did not address racialization, colonialization, imperialism whatsoever. It came from very white queer theorists from the elite in academia, and then it filtered down in Canada. It's also a bit of a generation marker too. So younger queer people are using the term, but the older don't. And also it's a class marker. Those who are educated use it. Those who aren't educated don't use it. So it's kind of like a term that hasn't really worked across the board, but that's okay too, because sometimes people just want to use language that they feel more comfortable with. But there are new kind of work coming out that talks about a post-queer theory, which talks about how queer theory didn't really help so much. Maybe it helps, I think it helps start the conversation. It helps us deconstructing categories, questioning normativities, and moving from a status quo to a status queer, in a sense. But we need to think about more of what's next for queer theory. And I think a decolonial perspective is crucial in order to have it more relevant to other people's lives and backgrounds. Like you said, Danielle, bringing up Paulo Freire, that history, that context is really important. And for queer theory now in the modern day is much more important because we want to make sure that it's applicable and useful. And if not, then what other theories can also be useful to help emancipate queer lives of all backgrounds or of different backgrounds?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that as many teachers and researchers from the audience belong to the National Project on Literacies or of Literacies, the decoloniality and decolonial studies will be one of the themes, let's say, one of the focuses for our next five-year project. So, of course, decoloniality in terms of literacies, education. So, and I think it's a very important debate. It's very important for us to start problematizing voices and studies that, of course, we learned and we have learned with them, but at the same time, when they travel to us, they become something different, totally different, because of the context, because of our history, like Joe mentioned, the dictatorship. And it's amazing, Robert, how we see now in Brazil. You see, I'm a little bit revolted today, right? I forgot to say that I am in Brussels, guys. Hello from Brussels. I have part of my family, Robert and Joe. They are always posting things in the family group of WhatsApp that they want the dictatorship back. They say, and then we have this discourse coming back, and we have a lot of work to do. And I think the decolonial perspectives help us deconstruct many of these ideas. It's just a pity that it's still within the academic walls. You know what I mean? It's still, of course, it's very recent, but it's still within academia and academic discussions.
I wonder, outside of formal education settings as well, how we can think about other spaces as educational in terms of providing a kind of public pedagogy about issues of gender and sexuality. Picking up on Robert's idea that The term queer, for example, has gained traction in some spaces, but not in other spaces. So I wonder if you could comment maybe about other spaces of queer pedagogy.
Sure. I mean, and actually, I don't want to plug, but that's my upcoming book. Looking at different, beyond queer pedagogy, what other forms of pedagogy can be useful towards advancing sexual and gender diversity. And so check for that in the next year. But anyways, what I feel is important here, is look at what's currently in practice, what can be useful. And so I'm thinking of, for example, of Indigenous education can be very useful toward bringing in Indigenous sexualities and genders as part of its platform. I'm thinking about peace education, for example, another type of pedagogy beyond that talks about peace and conflict and violence and ways to bring together reconciliation around different types of oppressed groups. And there is a space right there for sexual and gender diversity. And then I'm also thinking about critical pedagogy in general, of course, has always been akin to, but also feminist pedagogy, questioning gender and oppression towards women and how that includes trans women, for example. So it's whatever pedagogical approaches you decide, it's about finding those entry points for queerness, to have those conversations and that form of dialogue. It doesn't mean you need to talk about queer theory at all. It means that you can just advance the conversation through other pedagogical means.
Yeah, I agree. I was checking this handbook again of the critical concepts, and there is one chapter that I really, really liked. It's heterotopia, which is a Foucauldian concept. Basically meaning, at least for me, that it's something that is there, but it's heterotopic. It's something that it's placed there, but it welcomes other possibilities. And I was thinking about this heterotopia concept to think about these queer pedagogies, because for example, in São Paulo city, or in the big cities or in small cities, these heterotopic places, they are there, and they have always been there. The problem is that they are hidden because of the heteronormative context. I give you the examples of the clubbing, the clubs, simple example like pubs, or even the bathhouses. So all of these, they are heterotopic places that gays, especially gay men, now I'm talking about gay men, they had to design and find a place that seemed to be normal and natural within that landscape, but is functioning differently because it has to welcome diversity, it has to welcome all of this. So I think, Joe, that this happens all the time. I think it's a matter of getting to know, recognizing, and all of this. But I also think that it's more difficult for LGBT communities to it's almost like digging, you have to fight for these heterotopic places, heterotopias, in order to exist. Very differently from a heteronormative society, in which you have this place that is the heterotopic place, but all the others, they are the naturalized and the normal ones. I don't know if you're following me. So it's more difficult for this to happen, I think, for queer people. But again, it's not impossible. And the challenge is for those who are not queer to see that as not heterotopic, as something that belongs to society and deserves to be there. You see what I mean? Like the clubs, like the places for where LGBT people can meet each other you know, so that they can try to find a couple, for example, not only online. So I think there are many possibilities for this to happen. This queer pedagogy, pedagogizing, let's say, the issues around the queer and the queerness. But at the same time, it's really a challenge, at least for me. At least for me. I don't know if I have answered your question. Um,
Yeah, I think that raises an interesting point about where queer culture happens, you know, and again, if we compare to '97 when the Anna Maria Jagosa's book came out, online spaces and communities have, you know, assumed different kinds of roles. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the role of new types of interaction and communication that involve online, offline, and how that might shift the kind of interactions we have transnationally as well. There are icons who are, you know, have some kind of transnational queer currency. And if we think about Rihanna, for example, who is in Brazil, you know, taken as a diva by a lot of, you know, fan groups, which are queer spaces, as a, you know, a Caribbean artist who sings in English and Creole. So, what do you think might have shifted about queer culture and queer spaces in the last 20 years?
I think what the online world has introduced us to more so is the racialization of queer space. And I'm thinking about Andil Gozin's work in Toronto. Well, he's based at York University, but he's originally from the Caribbean. And, you know, and as someone who is a queer person of color, he tried an experiment whereas he was entering into queer gay male chat rooms posing as a white man, and he was getting a lot of interactions, but when he entered the room as a person of color, the interaction would take on very racist and very racialized tones as a result, and the interaction was very different. And so that's what we're seeing, I believe, more in the online world. We're seeing a bit more complications and in dialogues and discussions around race and sexuality and gender in general. And that could be helpful because we need to consider the more fulsome community, queer community and queer culture, rather than not just the white narrative that seems to be dominant, at least within the North American context. But the transnational pieces are very interesting. There's a really fabulous documentary called Coming Out in the Developing World. And as much as, you know, in that documentary, they talk about, and they go to different types of developing countries, and they start to bring in Madonna pop cultural references. In fact, and the people in those videos, they acknowledge the Americanization of queer culture through Queer as Folk, for example, and these other divas and pop cultural references. But at least, there was something that they can attach themselves to as well. And so it is a form of imperialism, a queer imperialism, a pinkwashing of the globe. But it also is, there is some currency there that could be very useful for queer people, especially in highly marginalized, highly oppressive contexts where they need to have some sort of space. I had a study participant from Saudi Arabia, for example, and he used to watch Queer as Folk in Saudi Arabia with his friends and found it to be a very positive experience. And it was able to just, and actually, because Queer as Folk is filmed in Toronto, it attracted him to Canada. But then unfortunately, it gave him the wrong impression that that's what life is like in Canada, where we're all just lovely, friendly, attractive queer people having sex all the time. And so it gave a real false impression, but at least it did give him a sense of community because he was able to connect in a very, very dangerous country to be gay, because you could be killed for being gay in Saudi Arabia. So it is a complexity around what you're suggesting around the online and offline. as well as around the transnationalism, but I think it's an opportunity for greater dialogue.
I would like to thank you once again for a fantastic conversation.
Thank
I hope we
you.
get a chance to talk more and to be in each other's physical company next time round. I'm going to hand it over to Dan to wrap it up. And thank everybody once again for being here and for some really great comments as well. And this is part of the community building that we're doing right now. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Joe. Let me just get the link back again, just to make sure that everybody will get the certificate. Some technical things before. This is the link. Sorry, guys, this is the link for the certificates for those who haven't. And so before I thank Robert and Joe, it was lovely afternoon. Thank you, Robert. Wow. It's so good. It's like I mean this conversation style of event is something I like so much because it goes really fast and we learn a lot from each other. Thank you so much. Let me just share with you the next event. Let me see here, and then we close. Let me just see here if we have it. Here are the questions. Yeah, this one. So next one will be em português. Então, o próximo vai ser... Será que está projetando? Deixa eu ver. Sim. Então, o próximo vai ser 12 de março, daqui a 2 semanas. Internacionalização e formação docente, pesquisas, projetos e práticas nas áreas de alemão, francês e inglês. Okay, so internationalization and teacher education, research projects and practices in the areas, the fields of German, French and English. Dort Uphoff, Heloísa Albuquerque Costa, Luciana Fonseca, todas da USP. Tá bom? Let me stop. Robert, would you like to say something, final comments, final words to the Brazilian audience, to the Canadian audience?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's participated today, and thank you for the excellent moderation, Joel, and your incredible insights, Danielle. It's been wonderful. And the comments, questions, I read them all, and they're fabulous. And please do keep the dialogue going. That's very important in this kind of live work.
Yeah, those who ask me, can I send them your email, Robert, so that they can get in touch with you?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I'm on Twitter. And you can also email me.
Okay, thank you. Joe, final words?
Congratulations, Danielle, on this seminar series and on bringing these topics to the classroom. It is something that takes courage and it's important because we all build on each other's experiences, and this kind of affective strength that we gain from talking to each other and sharing experiences is so important. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for moderating this. Guys, thank you so much. I'll see you next time for the seminars. Robert, Joe, thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.